Okay, welcome to the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey, and I've had a few requests to do an episode on Don Quixote. And so I started reading it in early October. It's almost exactly what I thought it would be, which is a testament to how influential it was on later modern novel writing. It's an episodic or picaresque novel in nature, which means that although there's a general sense of direction and plot, most of the chapters would do just fine as excerpts in an anthology. And this kind of is one of my early minor complaints about the book. I mean, it's a personal preference, but in picaresque novels, the characters are really two-dimensional, kind of flat. They don't really change. So it's comparable to a sitcom. Like, for example, Zach Morris didn't really evolve as a character very much through the course of Saved by the Bell. And the same goes for Don Quixote. Cervantes creates scenes that are sort of complete in themselves, at least once you've gotten to know his main characters. My own preference is for books where the characters go through significant psychological change, but again, here I'm not going to defend that view too much. The book is like 1,400 pages long, and so obviously I can't summarize it in 45 minutes. Instead, what I'll do in this episode is just give you a feel for what's happening in the novel, with some very brief synopsis. And then I'm going to do a lot of reflecting on what I like about the book, what I don't like, and why I think it's been so significant in terms of literary history, which it certainly has been. The first thing I want to say is that the central conceit of the novel, and the thing that makes it consistently funny, is the idea that Quixote himself is an obsessive reader of medieval chivalric romances in a time that has become modern. Okay, so that is to say, in 1612 or so, when the novel was published, people were beginning to feel, very much as most of us did growing up, I suppose, that we moderns were, beyond everything medieval. So like the printing press, the cultural innovations of the Renaissance, these kinds of things made medieval texts like the Golden Legend or Amadis of Gaul feel kind of hopelessly naive. And this is why people will tend to call Don Quixote the first modern novel. Now, before I go on about this, look for a minute at this page from Amadis of Gaul, a book which was written at the very outset of the 14th century, and one that Cervantes says Don Quixote read very closely. Quoting, "The child of the sea would not take off his helmet, lest the king should know him. And when Perion asked who he was that had succored him in such need, he persisted in concealing himself till the damsel took his helmet off. Then, presently, Perion knew him, that it was the youth whom he had knighted at the lady's request, and embracing him, he said, 'Truly, I now know you better than before.' 'Sir,' quoth the child, 'I knew you well, that it was you who gave me the order of knighthood, wherewith, so please it God, I shall serve you in the wars of Gaul.' They came at length to a double way, and the knight asked Perion which way he took. 'The left,' answered the king, 'for it leadeth to my country.' 'God have you then in his keeping,' quoth the child, 'for I must take the right.' 'Then,' said Perion, 'I pray you remember your promise.' So they took leave of each other. The damsel then said to the child of the sea, 'Sir knight, I have hitherto kept ye company, because the damsel who gave you the lance said she brought it for the best knight in the world, and surely I have seen so much that I know it was a truth. Now I will shape my course towards my lady. And who is she? Oriana, the daughter of King Lisuarte,' and so on. Okay, you get the idea. Now, here in this Amadis of Gaul, we have a book with plot, with characters. It existed before the printing press. It was even printed before 1500. And there were many others like it. In fact, Cervantes reports that Don Quixote himself possessed more than 100 similar volumes. So why is it that we call Don Quixote the first modern novel? Well, modern is the key word here. And what we're really asking is, what is the difference between a chivalric romance and a novel? And the answer is, a novel is way too cool for chivalric romances. In other words, it has too much self-awareness, and it laces up everything with irony and self-referentiality and even metafiction. Look, there's a lot to sort out here. I mean, it's not simple. First, Cervantes himself must have known the chivalric romances quite well. And this is one of the things that makes me scratch my head about people who read Don Quixote and find it funny, It's like, even though they've never read any of the medieval chivalric romances that inspired it, they find the parody of those romances funny. I'm kind of racking my brains here to find the exact contemporary equivalent. All I can come up with is something like this. It would be like if you went to see, or if like you fell out of your chair laughing at the Borat movies, but you had no understanding that like Sacha Baron Cohen is ridiculously caricaturing actual existing Kazakhstani people, right? Or like if you loved Monty Python's Life of Brian, but you never even heard of Jesus and the Gospels. I mean, I don't know, like imagine laughing at that line, "Blessed be the cheesemakers," without understanding that it was a callback to "Blessed be the peacemakers." Or like, what if you were a huge fan of "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," but you never even glanced at the Odyssey? Wouldn't that be kind of weird? The point here is that, I mean, it is rather strange that we enshrined Don Quixote as a classic, really as the first modern classic, while the whole thing seems to be based on like an ironic parody of a whole genre that existed before and that nobody reads now, right? And really, they stopped reading quite quickly by the time, around the time of Don Quixote. Now, this all gets more interesting the more you think about it. So, you have Cervantes himself, who must have read a ton of these chivalric romances, and he creates a character who also reads a ton of the chivalry stories, but who, unlike the author, insists on taking the chivalric romances as authoritative and reading them earnestly. And I suppose that's the main difference between Cervantes and his main character. Cervantes, the author, is ironic and detached, and his use of chivalric romance is satirical. Cervantes, unlike Don Quixote, is a thoroughly modern man who feels kind of above and beyond all that was contained in the old-fashioned romances. You might say Don Quixote was serious about returning to tradition, whereas Cervantes seems to think that's an embarrassing impulse, worthy of being made fun of. Modernity, in this sense, is almost defined by its superior attitude toward what preceded it. Stories about Lancelot or Amadis of Gaul, that type of stuff is naive, and that's written for simpletons. We're more sophisticated than that now, right? We are the modern, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, hyperliterate people of the future, and we know that acts of heroism basically never happen, so let's make fun of that perspective. So that's the basis for the humor in Don Quixote. Now this, I guess, is what I don't love about the book. It's fundamentally, in this sense, a modern and maybe even a progressive novel. And like everything progressive, it is kind of nihilistic at its foundation. And what content it does produce is based on earlier and more earnest traditional forms. So just as the modern progressives seem driven to simply oppose whatever Christianity supports, Cervantes, at some level, is just mocking everything that went before him. And once you understand this, a novel like Shyamala by Henry Fielding becomes a way cooler thing than its earnest original inspiration, the epistolary novel Pamela by Samuel Richardson. And the performative self-referentiality and many ironies of Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy seem like obvious continuations after something like Don Quixote. In these works, nothing is ever totally straightforward and heroic and sincere, Or you can think of Swift's Modest Proposal, for example, right? This is all very modern stuff by comparison with Amadis of Gaul. And all these books I'm mentioning, these are mostly British 18th century, are sort of the children of Cervantes. So the form that this takes in the novel is that the narrator is trustworthy. So for example, the narrator will say, quote, "As they were thus discoursing, there appeared in the road 2 monks of the order of St. Benedict, mounted upon 2 dromedaries, for the mules whereon they rode were not much less." But then, in the next paragraph, we read the character Don Quixote's description of the same scene. And he says, quote, "Those black bulls that appear yonder must be, and without doubt are, enchanters, who are carrying away some princess whom they have stolen in that coach, and I am obliged to redress this wrong to the utmost of my power." End quote. Okay, so as readers, we have to trust the author, right? And so wherever this disparity of perception occurs, we laugh at Don Quixote. We laugh that he is so deluded by all his book reading as to be unable to recognize a couple harmless monks on the road. Or is he crazy? Or is he out of his mind? That's probably a better explanation, and it's a little more interesting. I guess the idea here would be that, Dostoevsky's Underground Man, or like so many of us who grew up watching insanely unrealistic TV shows and movies, we have taken on so many unrealistic expectations from Hollywood programming that we can't even perceive reality as it actually is without adding a layer of complete nonsense. Here's the thing about that. It would be funny, I guess, only if we were sure that we weren't ourselves still entrapped in the same kinds of misperception. And that's the perspective that Cervantes, the author, takes. He sees clearly, his character Don Quixote doesn't. The problem I have with this is that, well, frankly, I'm a postmodernist. I do not feel the same confidence that Cervantes felt. And even if I did, it would seem sort of sad to me, all the delusion being inflicted on so many people by, media, right? And like I alone perceiving everything rightly, it seems unlikely. However, I suspect that the reason this worked in Cervantes' day was that pretty much everyone had turned the same corner. Only the real sticks in the mud were still seriously inclined to think in medieval terms when it came to morality and heroism and values and all of that. At some point, the holdouts just become ridiculous. But I hope you can see how this is not exactly the narrative I feel like I'm living in 2021. So consider the famous scene where Don Quixote first takes Sancho Panza, his squire, out fighting the windmills. Even if you haven't read the book, you've probably heard of that part, right? Well, how different is it from wearing pink pussy hats or going to a Black Lives Matter rally, or stopping going to a Black Lives Matter rally after the oligarchs want you to stop going, right? Or going to a CRT protest at the school board, or wearing masks, or talking about aluminum-based life forms that are in the vaccines. Who knows, right? Practically everyone I know seems to be tilting at windmills. And is it funny? And if it is funny, which author would be qualified to laugh at it because he's so sure that he's not deluded? And if he wrote the book, would it be wildly popular, or would it be, excoriated as, a conspiracy theory or something, right? But don't get me wrong, I'm actually really enjoying reading this book. I come from a family of extreme sarcasm and irony, and I've always loved humor, so I get it. Reading about Don Quixote getting kind of cracked on the helmet or turning a barmaid into the gallant maiden Dulcinea by a pure act of imagination, it is funny. But my favorite scenes are actually the metafictional, hyper-aware passages, where it's clear that Cervantes is not merely making fun of Don Quixote. In fact, if anything, he's probably making fun of some part of himself. I want to share one example of this with you. In chapter 11 of part 1, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza encounter some simple goat herds as evening falls one night. Charmingly, Sancho falls into a position of subservience, which, is ostensibly his role as squire. But immediately, Don Quixote invites him to share all of his food and sit alongside him, so that, in fact, they live as equals. But of course, Don Quixote gives himself a heap of imaginary credit for being, so humble and so charitable with regards to his squire. So anyway, the two guys share some food with the goat herds around a campfire, and then, taking up a handful of acorns, Don Quixote looks on them all attentively and delivers the following speech. It's a real doozy. I'm only going to give you about half of it, but I'm going to read about 30 lines here. And what you're listening for is Don Quixote's valorization of the past. But try to listen carefully, because I think it'll help me to get to the next level on this episode. Quote, "Happy times and happy ages, those to which the ancients gave the name of golden, not because gold, which in this our Iron Age is so much esteemed, was to be had in that fortunate period without toil and labor, But because they who then lived were ignorant of these two words, meum and tuum, in that age of innocence, all things were in common. No one needed to take any other pains for his ordinary sustenance than to lift up his hand and take it from the sturdy oaks, which stood inviting him liberally to taste of their sweet and relishing fruit. The limpid fountains and running streams offered them in magnificent abundance their delicious and transparent waters. In the clefts of rocks and in the hollow of trees did the industrious and provident bees form their commonwealths, offering to every hand, without usury, the fertile produce of their most delicious toil. The stout cork trees, without any other inducement than that of their own courtesy, divested themselves of their light and expanded bark, with which men began to cover their houses, supported by rough poles, only for a defense against the inclemency of the seasons. All then was peace, all amity, all concord. As yet the heavy coulter of the crooked plough had not dared to force open and search into the tender bowels of our first mother, who, unconstrained, offered from every part of her fertile and spacious bosom whatever might feed, sustain, and delight those her children, who then had her in possession. Then did the simple and beauteous young shepherdesses trip it from dale to dale, and from hill to hill, their tresses sometimes plaited, sometimes loosely flowing, with no more clothing than was necessary modestly to cover what modesty has always required to be concealed, nor were their ornaments like those nowadays in fashion, to which the Tyrian purpose and the so many ways martyred silk gave a value. Nor as yet were fraud, deceit, and malice intermixed with truth and plain dealing. Justice kept within her proper bounds, and so on. And believe it or not, this goes on for another half a page. And what is Don Quixote describing to these goatherds? A golden age in the past, the time when things were good, before all the pause crept in. And what I love about this is that, Cervantes himself did have to write it. He must at least have considered such a narrative of history. Yes, Cervantes was a modern man, free from the naive and over-simple superstitions of the Dark Ages, but, and this is what saves him for me, he hadn't totally forgotten. And because he hadn't totally forgotten, I can kind of roll with his humorous perspective on it. When Don Quixote goes to finish that absurdly long speech, Cervantes calls it tedious. But again, he wrote it. And listen to the finishing lines of the speech. Quote, "But now, in these detestable ages of ours, no damsel is secure, though she were hidden and locked up in another labyrinth like that of Crete. For even there, through some cranny or through the air, by the zeal of cursed importunity, the amorous pestilence finds entrance, and they miscarry in spite of their closest retreat. For the security of whom, as times grew worse and wickedness increased, the order of knight-errantry was instituted to defend maidens, protect widows, and to relieve orphans and persons distressed. Of this order am I, brother goatherds, from whom I take kindly the good cheer and civil reception you have given me and my squire." Okay, end quote. So, there you go. Cervantes wrote it. And I think some part of him must have understood it and kind of sympathized with it. Ultimately, this is the kind of thing that makes this novel really impressive. It holds up because it isn't simply a modern dismissal of everything old. Instead, even as he pokes fun at Don Quixote, Cervantes does allow us to enjoy this character, Don Quixote. And clearly, as I said, probably more than any of his readers, to this day, Cervantes himself enjoyed the chivalric literature. There's a fun page-long diatribe on the history of knights-errantry from Don Quixote, where he shows that Spain was not at all unaware of Britain's lore in the 17th century. One of the goatherds actually asks him about, what is this knight-errantry you're talking about? What is it? And Don Quixote replies, quote, "Have you not read, sir, the annals and histories of England, wherein are recorded the famous exploits of King Arthur, whom in our Castilian tongue we perpetually call King Artus, of whom there goes an old tradition, and a common one all over that kingdom of Great Britain, that this king did not die, but that by magic art he was turned into a raven, and that in process of time he shall reign again, and recover his kingdom and scepter. Continuing, and I know I should do, or sorry, not continuing, this is me now. And I know, by the way, I do know, you guys, in case somebody was about to say this, I should do an episode on King Arthur. Noted. But anyway, Quixote goes on and on about King Arthur and Amadis of Gaul and Felix Marte of Hyrcania and the never to enough be praised Tirante the White. And then he proclaims that he himself is of that profession, the knights errant, right? But then, undercutting and ironic as ever, the narrator begins the next paragraph by saying, quote, "By these discourses, the travelers were fully convinced that Don Quixote was out of his wits, and what kind of madness it was that influenced him, which struck them with the same admiration that it did all others at the first hearing." End quote. But see, I mean, I guess that's kind of interesting, isn't it? They think he's crazy, and they admire his craziness. And what's even more interesting is that, like, starting with Sancho Panza, his neighbor, like, who is, by the way, described as, like, honest and shallow-brained, who doesn't read himself, people often reciprocate Don Quixote's delusions with him. That is, they play the game in this kind of self-aware way. It's an interesting thing. Like, Sancho allows himself to be called squire, and he fully embraces the hierarchy and language, best he can, that would have been found in the romances Don Quixote read. So when DQ finishes his speech about King Arthur, the first of the goatherds to speak didn't exactly believe all of that stuff, but enjoying, because, like, you know, you're just sitting around a campfire, might as well let this crazy guy tell you about the Middle Ages. He does kind of allow and even encourage Don Quixote to continue the weird oration. So the goatherd says, sort of emulating the Middle Ages talk, I think, he says, "Methinks, Sir Knight Errant, you have taken upon you one of the strictest professions upon earth, and verily I believe that of the Carthusian monks themselves is not so rigid." And so you can hear in his tone that he's kind of feeding Don Quixote's own fantasy back to him. And this is maybe the most fascinating aspect of this book. We've all sort of heard of, like, social identity theory, or whatever it was called in Psych 101. The idea, you know, that the people around you sort of define you and, like, police your identity. But here, through, I guess, like, just a strong will and like, intransigent commitment to his vision, Don Quixote manages to get others to at least play with the idea that he is, in fact, one of the old-fashioned knights. And the result is actually kind of befuddling. Like, do they believe he's a real knight? Does he actually believe that they believe? Does he himself believe himself to be a knight, or is he just crazy? It's all kind of ambiguous here. Interestingly, here, I'll tell you a very adorable personal story. Growing up, I had been a long-term serial dater in my adolescence, so I had already had 4 or 5 girlfriends before I ever met my wife when I was 26. But when I did meet my wife in about 2004, and soon enough we started exchanging emails, and then completely spontaneously unplanned one day, having never practiced this act before in my life, I started writing to her in these emails in my best impression of Arthurian chivalric romance English, basically. Saying things like, you know, "Dearest lady, how comest thou hither to the Elysian fields of Indiana? I knoweth not, but, you know, ... and so on. And you know what? She loved it. Or at least I think she did. Or maybe I loved it and she tolerated it. I don't know. But in any case, we got married, right? So maybe there was some of this weird Don Quixote social identity theory stuff happening there. And then there's also the thing where, like, the medieval romance language feels to be the appropriate thing when you're trying to authentically, truly express love, because it's not ironic like all the more modern language that we find in the novels that follow. Anyway, as far as fiction goes, I personally really cut my teeth reading, like, 19th century American, mostly short stories. And these were writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who defined themselves as romance writers rather than novelists. So it's possible that I don't get it. I mean, but one of the things about Don Quixote that I don't love is that I see in it a lot of like tedious or incidental language. Things like it seems kind of indulgent on the author's part. Like in a story, in an 8 to 10 page story by Poe or Hawthorne, almost every single line, every word of the action is important. Almost every detail is included like very significantly and intentionally. But in Don Quixote, there are plenty of paragraphs where like nothing really meaningful happens. You don't really have to interpret every single paragraph. I suppose there's something to be said for just enjoying some good old-fashioned prose or good modern prose. But most of the really fun prose in Cervantes, to me, in my judgment, is actually in Quixote's soaring medieval romantic speeches. By contrast, the narrator's voice is fairly plain and modern. So when they're looking out for some lady named Marcella in the woods, for example, at one point, the narrator reports, for example, quote, "Having ranged through the woods for about 2 hours, looking for her everywhere without being able to find her, they stopped in a meadow full of fresh grass, near which ran a pleasant and refreshing brook, insomuch that it invited and compelled them to pass there the sultry hours of the noonday heat, which already began to come on with great violence." End quote. And in a scene like this, I mean, there's no significance to the woods or the grass or the heat, as there would be in Dante or Hawthorne. Instead, it's just a way to set up another conversation. Now, on the other hand, a lot of these conversations are pretty funny and interesting, if not always philosophically profound, so it's tolerable, I suppose. The last interesting scene I read before I flagged out, around page 200, by the way, was where Don Quixote and Sancho encounter a chain of galley slaves. Now, there's something in Quixote's chivalric moral code that finds the whole scene indecent. So he goes up to the guards, and he's going to go through the whole chain of prisoners and ask all of them what their crimes were that they find themselves now locked up. And he listens carefully, and he asks sympathetic follow-up questions. And at the end of it all, he requests that the guards let the prisoners go. Now the guards, of course, refuse. And soon enough, Quixote is attacking them, with one of them even being wounded with a thrust of the lance. Long story short, he frees the prisoners and tells them to all go to Dulcinea. This is his like mistress, maiden lover who he wants to, court. The barmaid from back home, his mistress, okay? And to tell her, he makes the prisoners go and tell her that, quote, "The knight of the sorrowful figure did this noble thing to honor her," etc., etc., etc. So it's pretty funny, but it's also like totally crazy, right? So I would say this in closing. I mean, this is a novel you should read if you want to be into novels, if you're into literary history. I regret that I didn't look at it sooner. Although to me, I mean, I had read books like Lawrence Stern and the Shyamala book, and I read like Modern Chivalry, by the way, which is a good one by Hugh Henry Brackenridge, an early American picaresque novel. So like, I kind of knew what to expect with Don Quixote. But anyway, to me, having read so many of the novels that come after it, and that kind of go even farther in the same direction, it isn't very surprising. I mean, I guess it's like how you should watch those first movies, first good movies by like Godard or Ingmar Bergman as like examples of the first modern movies. I mean, see, okay, like part of what has always fascinated me about art, about narratives, is genre and how like form and genre work together and how new forms and genres emerge when there are new technologies, for example, or in new epochs. Shakespeare's plays were, for example, a whole new thing following the passion plays and morality plays of the Middle Ages. In those plays, characters would often just wear like sandwich boards that said like love or wrath or envy across their chest, and then they would interact. It would be like, a discussion between love and envy or something. But in the same way, Cervantes, is in the same way as Shakespeare, Cervantes took it to the next level, and his novel really is something different and more self-aware than the medieval romances. Even though his characters seem relatively two-dimensional compared to the novels that would follow in the 18th and 19th century, there is something charming about the dramatic irony and the divergent perspectives of the narrator and the protagonist in Don Quixote. And I think all of this is kind of certainly noteworthy and probably a kind of a true first in literary history. So it definitely earned its place. I know there's always been a cottage industry among academics saying things like, I don't know, whatever, such and the rise of the individual self, or the rise of selfhood in, the 12th century or the 15th century, as if like selfhood, But it really does seem like the novel is the vehicle of the Enlightenment. And that somehow, even in 1612, I know that's early to call it the Enlightenment. It's certainly post-Renaissance, though. Cervantes, even in 1612, I suppose like Shakespeare, that early at the same time, caught a glimpse of what was coming. It really does seem true that this new form, with its emphasis on irony and perspective, the novel, was a post-Reformation, proto-Enlightenment, individualist kind of a form. And so it's odd when we read the earliest manifestations of it. I guess it's like reading the Constitution, which now seems fairly traditional and old-fashioned, but which in its time was radical and progressive and something new under the sun. And that's what I'm saying about Don Quixote. But at the same time, I am still under the sway of this kind of newish political, philosophical view that we've all maybe gone a little too far in the direction of atomized individualism now and liberalism. And so I'm a little standoffish about the happy and sometimes condescending detachment of Cervantes, who himself depicts a man trying to stay meaningfully in touch with the values of the past while the modern world moves on, as something to be laughed at, right? Like that's Cervantes' angle on this Don Quixote figure. Now maybe there could be a new hot take, a revision of Don Quixote, where, for example, the narrator might understand that even though the entire world has moved on and modernized, Quixote himself was correct and righteous, for clinging to the values of the past. Such a revision would involve finding a more serious and quieter narrating voice. But I don't know. Maybe I'm like a buffoon for thinking something like that to be possible. Maybe such an impulse, this return to tradition impulse or whatever, really is kind of laughable at some point. Maybe Heraclitus was right. Everything changes all the time. Stop trying to live in your grandparents' mindset. Okay, I guess so. I kind of understand. And I understand the charm of that in 1612, when people felt like, all right, like we've had Leonardo da Vinci, we have the printing press now, we're translating the Bible into the local languages. Like there's a lot going on. They really did. Like the 15th and mostly 16th centuries would have felt, I think, the most similar to our own time out of the past 1,000 or 1,500 years. Anyway, the last point, it was Nathan Rodriguez, my famous comedian friend, who asked me to do an episode on Don Quixote. I'm glad I did it, although it feels ridiculously impossible to try to summarize this book. You kind of just have to read it. And I don't know, I usually never give people this kind of permission, but I think it would be cool if you just read the first 200 pages of this book or so. I did read some of the secondary literatures, by the way, and the criticism agreed with my hunch, which is that there's not a lot of change in the character of Don Quixote. I guess at the very end of part 2, which is, page 1370 or something, he kind of has to give up knight-errantry in order to come to a closure in the novel or something. But there's not a lot of psychological insight or change that goes on, in spite of the fact that he deals with constant setbacks and defeats and difficulties. But anyway, all of this did put me to reflecting again, by the way, on what comedy is. That's why I mentioned Nathan and his, I think he performed at the Comedy Store one time, at least one time. But what is comedy, sort of ontologically? What is laughter? What does it mean? I wonder whether it's always kind of culturally acidic? In other words, is it always deconstructive? Does it always tear down? Or can it be affirming? It's sort of hard to imagine like conservative comedy to me. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I don't know. I watched Chappelle's latest special last week, and for example, I wasn't blown away. It's pretty good. I mean, he's no doubt one of the greats, but it wasn't, I don't know, I've laughed harder. It seems like comedy is kind of dead these days. Something about the times we live in make this period in history seem very different from Cervantes' time. Like, again, they were post-Renaissance. They had this view that, like, things were getting better. We're going into the brave new future. We're a part of it. What a time to be alive. I think a lot of us are feeling less like that and more like, maybe a little bit of chivalry re-injected into a world with TikTok wouldn't actually be so funny. It might be good, So anyway, I don't know. I can almost connect these dots, but I don't have it all quite threaded together yet. Anyway, I'm almost out of time. Thanks for listening. Probably back to Plutarch for the next episode, but I also got a copy of Xenophon because I don't want there to be anything that Leo Strauss ever read that I haven't read for myself personally, and we'll get into it. Interestingly, by the way, because Strauss cites Xenophon a lot, I was reading the preface to this. This was a preface written in 1966, I think, by a guy named, hold on, you'll be interested, George Cockwell. And, George Cockwell, and translated by Rex Warner. So this is the edition you want to get, if you want to get one. But anyway, it said that, like, in this version, there was this discovery of some text in, like, 1909 in Egypt that seems to kind of have undermined some of what Xenophon was saying about things. And maybe he's not as reliable as people in earlier times had believed. So we'll get into, narrative, reliable history, postmodern history, and so on in a near-ish future episode. But this is a pretty big thickie, and it's basically, if you are interested in reading along in Xenophon, you have to read Thucydides first, because this is basically like, he picks up page one of Xenophon is the last page of Thucydides. He just tries to continue the narrative for the next 50 or 100 years. So, okay, anyway, I'm out of time. Thanks for listening to the Don Quixote episode. Subscribe to my Patreon. It's in the link in the description. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.